Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Well, how often do we hear that from college students who go home just for vacation?
Right.
And are back in the home environment and find it increasingly difficult to fit in there,
right.
Precisely because they are changing. I mean, how often do we hear a young woman say, geez, I'm back home. My mother treats me like I was 16 and I was a junior in high school, and here I am a more developed, mature person, and she doesn't seem to recognize it.
Joining Father Bacik in today's Reflections is Dr. Norman Gadan, the director of the Counseling Center of the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik and Dr. Gadan will be discussing the relationship of college students to their families. Now, here's Father Bacik.
Well, Norm, you and I have had many interesting conversations over lunch, and I always find you to be a fascinating person to talk to, and you have a lot of good ideas, and I like to listen to those. However, on this program, I'm not just going to listen. This is not an interview program. It is not one for you. We have 27 minutes on this program, and if I don't talk at least half of that time, the people who sponsor it don't like it. So that we must reverse the pattern of our lunches when we get together, because I figure usually do about 9/10 of the talking. So this time you have to sort of...
What my wife says, too.
She has the same complaint.
Right, she certainly does.
Well, I'm hopeful that
she'll appreciate your earlier comments, sir.
Let's make sure your wife is listening to this program and that she hears these comments that I have made. But I think that
well, fair enough. I'm going to take up the challenge, and I know what we're going to talk about tonight is something that's dear to the hearts of many of us, the transition from high school to college.
How did you know
that?
Well,
I just took a wild guess, and I want to know about yours, and then if there's time, I'm going to tell you a little about mine, and we'll try and weave in some basic fundamental truth in the midst of it.
Okay, all right. So that's right, transition from home to college.
Do you remember your own? Do you remember those days?
I do remember those days. I remember being homesick.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, as one component in it.
Now you left Toledo to go to college?
I left Toledo.
Right.
I was down in southern Indiana at St. Meinrad, as a matter of fact, in which I lived an extremely sheltered existence, in which I was not in contact with the outside world. And I remember all the troubles I had with that and how difficult that was for me, because I grew up in a family where I knew great freedom and responsibility, and my parents were sort of insistent on that, and I moved into an environment that was so difficult. Of course, this is atypical now, and it's not going to help us all that much, but just to respond to your question, and it was a very enclosed environment, and I found it extremely stultifying, extremely detrimental to development and growth, and a terrible way to live, really, and I rebelled against it. I had many ways in which personally, psychically, I needed to rebel against it in order to keep my sanity, as I said then. But I would say in retrospect, I would say more in just to keep the developmental tasks moving forward. Your turn.
I was at a restaurant with my wife and some friends in Ann Arbor some years ago, and it was one of these excellent seafood restaurants. We were having a lobster, I think, and some white wine. And I looked around and I said, did this building, in Ann Arbor there are many restored buildings made into restaurants. I said, did this building ever serve a different function? It's got something familiar about it in this locale here. And the friends we were with, who lived in Ann Arbor all these years since college, said, this used to be the train station. And I said, oh my God, this is where I landed at age 17, off the train, got in a cab, scared little guy from Peoria, Illinois, going to become a freshman at the University of Michigan. And I stayed scared for a good long time. I was totally unprepared for it. I don't think I ever did see an academic advisor or an academic counselor. I didn't even know what they were. We picked courses in the dorms according to what some upperclassmen told us about them. And it was
the
very
scary size of the place was scary.
Although in those days it was approximately the size the University of Toledo is today.
But still, 21,000 students running around, and many faculty members.
A lot of decisions to make, a lot of choices to make, all new people. I didn't know anybody there, and it was just a kind of overwhelming experience. I remember calling home on Sunday morning, trying to give the folks some expression of my gratitude for the opportunity to be there, but also letting them know, I just don't know if I can make it. It's real different from high school, where any of us who studied or who did very well really hit it. Friends of mine had no idea that I got good enough grades to even go on to college. Most of my friends did not, and it was not a prized or esteemed kind of value in the environment I grew up in.
You know, what you've described there, of course, I think is the typical situation of so many young people who go away from home and go off to college. I mean, larger and larger numbers, or greater and greater percentage, go to large institutions, although surely some go to our smaller liberal arts colleges and in some cases community colleges where they don't really leave home. But I think that they're included in this conversation of transition from home to college, because even the student who lives at home and goes off to college is still facing a new world and still has new challenges and is forced to rethink their relationship with their parents and with their siblings at home.
Perhaps it's even more difficult for many of them in a way. They have to go through some of these changes, especially becoming more independent, more autonomous, making up more of their own decisions, while at the very same moment perhaps living in the same room, sleeping in the same bed, studying at the same desk that they have all throughout elementary and high school. And parents are still there, so it demands more immediate change and trust and flexibility on the part of really an entire family.
That's right.
Those of us who had the
conflicts very often are greater because they're experienced on a day-to-day basis, because you're living in an environment that has a different value system very often, and is teaching one to think for oneself and to do one's own thing in a way and go in one's own directions, and living in a home where people are expected to be pretty much the same as they always were. Well, how often do we hear that from college students who go home just for vacations and are back in the home environment and find it increasingly difficult to fit in there, precisely because they are changing? I mean, how often do we hear a young woman say, geez, I'm back home. My mother treats me like I was 16 and I was a junior in high school, and here I am, a more developed, mature person, and she doesn't seem to recognize it. One of the tasks really along the line is to develop a more adult relationship with parents, isn't it, as a result of the college years?
That takes time, whether one's a residential college student or a college student living at home or not in college. Those years from 16 to 25 are going to be difficult and challenging and demand a lot of give and take, really, and of patience on the part of all concerned.
And if we just put that in just slightly broader context, this is going to happen to someone no matter what they choose, whether they're off getting a job, whether they're continuing their schooling, even if they are unemployed for a while. It still is the same developmental task to relate to parents, to family in a new way.
In addition to being kind of feeling maybe uprooted, lonely, scared, there's feeling sad and homesick and times depressed. I know I felt that especially the first couple of months of college being away. Many of our students at the university do, especially the residence hall students. And, of course, many families and parents do. There's a sense of loss. As much as parents today are excited and pleased and gratified by a child going to college, there's a sense of loss and of change that can be difficult for them for a while, and they get the blues. What we try and emphasize in our work with families and students, especially during orientation, is stay in touch. Don't forget the card, the letter, the birthday gift, the phone call. Don't let the student come away to college feeling as if they're no longer needed or recognized or appreciated. By the same token, don't tell the folks all the bad news, the C you got in something and the date that didn't work out. Tell them some of the good things so they can know it's a pretty decent experience.
So we're trying to keep that relationship and to let it grow and develop, but make sure that the support that was an important part of it is still there, and that people still care about one another, taking one another's feelings into consideration. I suppose one part of that, what you were saying, the parents have to continue to be supportive. It would help them if they have educated their youngsters to freedom along the way, wouldn't it? I mean, that there is a gradual sense of greater responsibility, of letting go, of allowing them to make their own decisions, so that college life is not so traumatic in terms of decision-making, and suddenly having this whole variety of choices, options, worldviews, philosophies, lifestyles that you're bombarded with. The question becomes, am I prepared at all to deal with that? And you can't prepare anyone totally for it, but surely one thing that parents do well is to gradually initiate their offspring into greater freedom.
And by the same token, what the student or son or daughter does is to try and draw upon their successful use of that freedom early on in the college experience when they're the most threatened or inundated or face the most challenge. And the research study suggests that the coping of students is helped a great deal by the use of past experience and by the use of rehearsal and anticipation. For example, during the summer before college begins, a great number of students start thinking about, well, what will the people be like? What will the students be like? What's the campus going to be like? Is it going to be like that day I spent there on the orientation visit? What am I going to like my teachers? The usual kinds of questions. Am I going to be able to handle it? Will I fit in? And they have little fantasies and ideas, and some write diaries, some keep notes, some paint a picture. Some begin to rehearse in their own mind and their own fantasies the ways in which they're going to cope. And sure enough, people who do that, and the majority of people do, tend to draw upon those experiences and use them. All kinds of rehearsal, almost a kind of role-playing inside their own minds.
That's probably a good technique in life generally, isn't it, when one is anticipating some major change in life?
Surgical patients do the same thing, and there are studies which suggest if you do that, even though you become more anxious to some extent while you're rehearsing, there tends to be a payoff, as opposed to somebody who says, oh, I'm not scared at all, there's nothing to worry about, I'm just going to have an operation. Let me just add, too, that the challenge of leaving home, or at least psychologically leaving home if you happen to be a commuter student, is compounded by what goes on inside us. And we don't really understand it fully, but the concept of the ego ideal, I think, fits in here a bit. We've tended through the elementary years and on into adolescence to idealize perhaps teachers, usually parents, sometimes one parent as opposed to another, and we form an ideal based on this composite of usually adults of what we'd like to be like in our lives, the kind of person we want to be, the kind of achievement we want to have, how we want to live. And as we move away from home, that ideal tends to change. It tends to become more in line with what we're like. It tends, if you will, to become more realistic, more affected by our friends and by new adults and teachers we meet in college. And it usually, for most of us, tends to get toned down a little bit. While we think, yeah, maybe we had a chance at becoming president, now we may settle for a profession or a professional career. So we're, in a sense, pulling away inside our minds from some very important people, some very important institutions, sometimes, as I guess in our case, an entire geographic region and city and set of friends and relationships. We pulled away from a whole network of support. And at the same time we're doing it externally, we're doing some important things internally, rearranging, in a sense, ourselves. There's a phrase I like, reshuffling ourselves, all the different components of ourselves. And a key part of it here is not just our external relationship with our family and parents, but the residue of that inside us, which isn't necessarily always ruptured or thrown away or obliterated, but gets reworked and reshaped in terms of current experiences.
And very often that is a difficult thing to do and causes problems. Let's talk a little bit, Norm, about the kinds of situations where people don't adapt terribly well or where they're having problems through the college years. I mean, one obvious one is that the freshman that I talk to every year who is really so homesick and so having so much trouble with the university setting that they want to go home after a month and simply thinking they can't make it, and one has to sort of stay with them, tell them that there's opportunities, that they've made this decision at this point, they ought to stick with it, and so on. So perhaps that homesickness needs to be looked at a little more carefully, what that's all about, and the opportunity to find ways to cope with it. I mean, that's what we're trying to help people to do. And I guess a lot of times I try to tell people to involve themselves in their studies, that it's a great chance to, do the hard, if they got a paper to write by the end of the quarter, write it in that first month and try to get it out of the way, do the research, and involvement in activities, social activities and so on, seems to be part of a way of going about this. I think also trying to find some sort of supportive community that can assist them, a peer community, that other students who will help them as they go along. But so there's one kind of thing, characteristic that we would have to watch. That is the one who wants to give it up right away.
Right.
And we have to try to help them to stay with it and to give it a decent chance. I think we have to say, obviously, college isn't for everyone. Some people don't belong there, and the proper decision is to get out, but not usually after 1 month.
Right.
One
I
would
certainly,
like a longer
certainly
period
agree
of
with
time.
you that most people are able to weather that kind of a storm if they feel especially homesick or depressed, sad, blue during the first month or 6 weeks. That typically this will change. Now, if it continues on past Christmas, perhaps then a student might consider going to a counselor, advisor, mentor, minister, what have you. But I think sometimes we're too quick to say, oh, well, maybe this isn't for you, maybe you ought to go home after a month or so, whereas in fact, to go through some of the mourning, and I think it's fair to call it that, there is a kind of mourning here, a kind of grief process, maybe too strong a term, that goes on for a number of students. They've left physically a great deal, and they're in the process of eroding and changing the internal representation of all that. And there is a kind of grief process, and students of the college age, I think, are able to feel that, to accept it, and then to cope with it. So how do they cope? In the ways you've described. Sometimes they throw themselves into their work. Sometimes they're able to get a great deal of support by talking to friends, roommates, people they meet, support groups. Other students are able to kind of reason it through. And by this I don't mean rationalize or try and make sense of something that doesn't make sense, but to kind of reason through the process, to get a new kind of perspective on their life, to see themselves in a stage of development in a sense, and that things are changing. And that does involve pain, grief, unhappiness
I
at
suppose
times.
that one of the things they feel strongly is that back in high school, they knew who they were, where they fit in the total scheme of things. They had their friends. You knew where your locker was and what you were going to do. There were expectations all set up, and suddenly you're in this new environment where you can't even find your way around and so on, and that's bound to cause trouble. I think one of the things that people worry about these days is that students in that sort of vulnerable position are going to get involved in groups that aren't good for them. I mean, that's where that whole word of cult comes up. I think the cults very often appeal to that kind of insecurity, and they do it. They almost are a new family-type situation. I think it's one way of analyzing cults. Not that they're widespread, not that parents should worry about that being on every campus or, their kids are in great danger.
But an interesting extreme example of a process.
Example of what happens. And what they appeal to is this family sense. You come in with us and you've got a family, a new sense of security. We've got a strong leader here who almost acts probably like your father or your mother did. And here you are. Now you'll have this support of this warm, loving community. It is one of the attractions of the cult situation, and students do have to be on alert for that. And,
I think so, because what little I know about the cult suggests that they're able to very carefully screen out and choose and seek the people that they know they can appeal to. And that part of what they're looking at, I suspect, is exactly what you're talking about. In a sense, a replacement of what was at home, or what never was, but what's desired. There's a kind of a perfection about it. The cult may be all things that this person was ever looking for.
That phrase you said there, it makes me think of one of the problems too that students get into on campus in relationship to home. That is, we got to think of people who have come from difficult home situations. After all, look at the amount of divorce situations, unhappy home situations, and one of the things that I think sometimes happens is they get to college, maybe they have a roommate who has really loving parents. They send them packages, call them on the phone, and so on, and everything's great. And I think that is a different kind of problem yet. When they move into the new setting, they're seeing the deficiencies of their own family life. I mean, I think it occurs a lot like this. People think, their friends say, well, I told my mother about the last date I was on and what happened. And you talked to your mother about that kind of thing and so on. And they begin to think, geez, there's something wrong with my relationship at home. And that's another factor that makes them redo it or rethink it, or perhaps causes them great psychic distress, as a matter of fact.
Two components in the cults that I think appeal to many of us when we're looking at ourselves and, in a sense, trying to reassort or reassemble ourselves like we might as an adolescent, are unity and the ideal. And as far as I know, most of what are called cults today have those components in them. There's a leader who's easy to idealize, beliefs and values that are set up as the ideal. And as you do that, you're able to become part of a unity, part of a group, and part of a unity with the leader who also represents the ideal. And there's a kind of a fusion with the ideal that is a perfect antidote to an 18-year-old, let's say, coming from an unhappy home life, struggling with a new kind of a transition into college life, pretty upset, feeling low, nowhere to turn, very vulnerable and at risk to that kind of a process and those kinds of people.
They need to at least be alert to that.
Really.
Right.
And we need to be alert that it looks like most of them who go into these cult-like processes tend to come back out within 2 years or less and reassemble and put their lives back together.
That brings up a point that I think is a note of optimism about all this. And there's a study that was done by Nork and a group in Chicago that talks about the whole thing of students reappropriating the values of their parents later on. They're finding out that it happens, at least in our Catholic circles where they studied it, when people would get married, and especially when they would have their first child and bring it to baptism, that they are forced to rethink, and that very often the students, the sons and daughters, turn out to come back to the values of their parents more than one would have thought. In other words, they needed their period of rebellion, needed their period when they thought it through themselves. But it's the common statement, like, geez, my father's thoughts look better to me as I get older, or my mother's way of doing things appeals to me.
Great wisdom in that statement. Yeah. Almost all the current studies of more or less normal college students end up with the same general finding, that values, attitudes, beliefs on key issues tend to be much closer to the parental values and the values of the home and church that one was raised in than was thought some 10, 15 years ago.
I remember telling people so often, even in the 60s and in the early 70s, when we did have the demonstrations on campus, and we talked the campus riots and all of this, the movements and so on, that actually I always saw the college situation as sort of a mirror image of the society as a whole. I mean, it is a free time. It is an opportunity for people to rethink and to reevaluate. But underneath, the problems are the same. Someone asked me not long ago, well, what differences do you see in the last 20 years you've been working with young people and so on? I said, the first thing that comes to my mind is the similarity. Mm-hmm. The first thing I think of is they keep dealing with sexual problems, relationship problems, and so on. And so that all the way through, they have to redo this relationship with their parents. The values of the parents keep coming out. So I think that is something, often a comforting point, I think, for parents when they are trying to think of their offspring going off to school and so on.
Let me read you a couple of sentences if there's time here.
Go ahead.
And I'm quoting, "More personally, I look at my expectations as a freshman. They were vague, yet I get a sense of myself counting on the university experience to give me a lot. I see these expectations as natural, yet certainly naive. Mainly, I doubt that I realize the amount of effort that I would have to put out to make the kind of human and mental contact that I was looking for possible. Periods of apathy or disappointment, yes, but nothing like that lasted too long to endure." That's from a senior who graduated from a West Coast university in 1971. So it sounds very familiar, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Let me see if I can find something else
I'm
here.
not sure you have time to find another quote yet, Norm. But
there is a kind of continuity in student life, late adolescence, early adulthood, through these transitions that I think spans the generations.
What are we going to tell students now as they get in their last years of college, and tell the parents as well about their new form of relationships? I mean, I want to tell the parents that they have to learn to deal with their offspring in a more adult way. They have to allow them to change and so on. And I think for the students, I'm often telling them to stay in contact and to be grateful for what they've been given. I mean, geez, that's so important. They've had an opportunity for college education. So often the parents have sacrificed financially, given up vacations and so on. They must express that kind of gratitude to their parents, I think. I think they need it for their own self-esteem and as just the proper and right thing to be done.
Exactly. I think it's what we owe our parents at any stage. They're doing the best they can, and we as parents are doing the best we can. And it's really what we owe our parents, I think, morally and philosophically and psychologically at that point. We don't owe them any more obedience. or a lifestyle or a career that suits them.
Right.
We owe them gratitude and
to do our best as offspring, to do our best. I think that's one of the things we want to say. I find myself telling that to students who feel imprisoned by their parents yet, that say, hey, you best serve them by doing all you can do to be a good person and to live a good life. And very often I think that becomes of great help to them in trying to become a more adult. Well, Norm, we've been talking here about the relationship of students to their families. We've seen some of the trauma of going away to school, and it is. I don't think we want to overplay it, but you kept using the word grief, and I think that's true. There's a sense of loss. The parents have to think in terms of, well, he's going off on his own. She's going to be doing her own thing now, and that becomes important. And on the other hand, for the student to realize others have gone through this, I like, too, what you said about fantasizing it ahead of time, getting back to thinking, replaying it ahead of time, role-playing it, thinking I could do it, and how am I going to manage and deal with new situations. That, in course, I think will assist them, enable them to do that in better fashion. And then as the whole thing goes on, we want those students not to give up too soon, to keep working at it, and stay in contact, keep the relationship going, so the parents are continuing to be supportive as they go along, and students are remembering especially gratitude, to thinking all that their parents have done for them. And then they'll do their best for their parents by finally turning out to be great human beings and using the talents and the values that their parents gave them originally.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Dr. Norman Gadan, the director of the Counseling Center of the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was the relationship of college students to their families. Comments or questions on this show or suggestions for future topics should be sent to Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Campaign of the Diocese of Toledo.